This is Reconstructing the Union Objective 1, and we're going to cover Part A of the outline here regarding the post-war questions and problems that faced the South after the Civil War. And as you can see in the photo here, the circumstances for the South were not very good. Just to give you an idea of the stark contrast between the South after the war and the South before, take a look at the following slides. Prior to the war, this is what people remembered the South as. Very elaborate plantation mansions that all had great size and similar characteristics. You can see here, there's a person walking down these steps there, just to give you a sense of scale and size to this whole thing. These plantation complexes were massive. I'm going to take you on a little tour of the South so you can just get a look at the differences and similarities between all the different mansions. You'll notice that most of them have a very Greek architecture effect, and that's generally regarded as being the standard commonplace way of having a plantation complex in the South. It was all very regal and represented the planter aristocracy in terms of wealth. Scenes like this had been very common in the pre-war South, where you'd have Spanish moss on sprawling grounds with a big house in the background. And in fact, the idea of the Southern plantation in the antebellum South, or the South prior to the Civil War, had become a part of American Romanticism. When people looked at the South and the Southern gentlemen and the Southern belles, the antebellum South and these kind of scenes were what they thought about. But after the war, the scenes are obviously very different. Union armies had marched through. They had burned plantations out. They had basically ground them down to powder and dust. They had left them in rubble and ruin, and basically left them as hollow shells of what they used to be. The post-war South, at least in the rural areas especially, was not the antebellum South that people knew prior to the Civil War anymore. And it wasn't just the countryside. The cities of the South were drastically affected too. This is Atlanta back in 1864, the crown jewel of the South, prior to Sherman coming through. And then in 1864, heading into 1865, Sherman is going to occupy Atlanta. You can see some Union troops in the background right over here. And eventually Atlanta is going to be burned to the ground. Fires started in almost every building, and just basically watching it burn. Now, this scene is from Gone from the Wind, but you get the basic idea. Charleston, South Carolina was also a bustling port. It was a city on the coast of South Carolina. It's also in this area over here, Charleston Harbor, where you found various forts, including Fort Wagner, which the Massachusetts 54th had tried to take. Charleston was a major seaport city that was also completely and totally decimated after the war was over. And of course, the Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia, was not spared. During its heyday, the Confederate capital was a monument to the Confederacy, a monument to Southern pride. But in the final days of the war, Richmond as well was turned into basically rubble and dust and completely burned out by Union armies. In a situation like that, the most obvious question, if you take a look at A1 on the post-war question and problems, is how is the South going to be rebuilt? Most major cities, and there weren't a lot of major cities in the South, but most of the ones that were down there looked like this when the war was over. Basically dust and broken stone and weeds and lack of agriculture. Cities and towns decimated economically with banks that didn't have money anymore and stores that had been closed down. Just a completely backwards economic situation. And even if they had goods, there was really no way to transport them. There weren't that many railroads in the South to begin with, but Sherman on his march through Atlanta, and through the center of Georgia to the sea, had heated up railroad ties and twisted them up like pretzels, trying to undo that whole mess and fix the railroads. Even if you had goods, you couldn't really transport them. And those weren't the only questions that were affecting the South during this time. Take a look at A2. What about former slaves? It was great that they'd been emancipated. It was great that they had their freedom, but they had no really remarkable job skills. I mean, the only thing they knew how to do was work. They couldn't even read and write. So you emancipate the slaves, but now what? What are you going to do? Where are you going to send them? What kind of things are they going to be able to do with their lives? The government had to address that because you had an entirely new free voting population and really no support systems in place for them. Also, what about getting back into the Union? Southern cities and southern townsfolk and people were taking a look around at this situation, and so was the North, and saying that they'd never been through this kind of thing before. The United States had never broken apart. How are you going to bring it back together? What is that process? What's all involved with that? And who's going to be in charge of it when you put the plans into effect? Is it going to be the President of the United States? Is it going to be Congress, half of whom want the South completely and totally punished for treason, and the other half who want to take a more moderate approach and let them decide for themselves when they want to get back in the Union and gradually work their way back in? Or will the states themselves decide? And what are we going to do with the former Confederate leaders? These were people who had actively rebelled against the U.S. government. What would the punishment be for them? For Jefferson Davis here, he was put in jail for 2 years after the Civil War ended, only to be pardoned in 1868 by President Johnson, who was kind of a Southern sympathizer. He also had his U.S. citizenship taken away, and it wasn't renewed until 1968, 100 years after the Civil War and well after his death. But was that punishment enough for these guys? Perhaps the answer was to hang them. In the eyes of many, they had committed treason. Maybe it was the best thing to do to hang them from the gallows in the shadow of the Capitol dome while people climbed trees to observe everything that was going on, whether they be reporters or soldiers or whoever. That could draw lots of large crowds and, in the eyes of many, give the South what they deserved. Maybe the best option was to embarrass them and make them public examples. Guys like Robert E. Lee here had been greatly respected by the Union. He had friends that were Union generals. He had gone to West Point with them. He had fought with them in the Mexican War. And some of them were pallbearers at his funeral in 1870, only 5 years after the Civil War ended. Lee spent the last years of his life demoralized because the federal government decided to make an example of him and what he stood for and what the Confederacy had stood for. How did they do that? Well, Lee's most prized possession was his home, and the Confederates often saw this as a symbol of Lee's elegance and grace. So did the Union, for that matter. And after the war was over, the Union decided this was the perfect place to make a symbol out of Robert E. Lee. They didn't want to tear down the mansion or burn it or take over his land in any particular way, except for one. They wanted to make Lee's property a reminder of all the deaths and sacrifices that Union soldiers had made. And so, for the last 5 years of his life, Robert E. Lee's home became the overlook for what we know now today as Arlington National Cemetery. This is all Lee's former property. His house on the hill there today still looks over the dead soldiers of the federal government who sacrificed their lives for the Union in the Civil War. It was a fitting punishment for Lee when the war was over, although not the same kind of punishments that people wanted to afford to guys like Jefferson Davis and other Southern leaders. They had a special respect and affection for Lee that was a little bit different. So when this is all said and done, how are these questions going to be answered? Well, it's going to be kind of a difficult process, and when you take a look at Objective 1, Part 2, we'll start with what's going to happen with newly freed slaves.